The co-creator of the TV comedy show Father Ted, Graham Linehan, who was arrested at Heathrow last week, says he has no regrets over social media posts about trans issues, which led to him being held on suspicion of inciting violence.
What you say?
If a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he's committing a violent, abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls.
What was your reaction to being arrested?
I got very, very angry.
What you say?
Holy shit! I don't fucking believe it. I'm under arrest. I'm going to sue you into the ground. I'm going to sue you into the ground. I'm going to sue you into the ground. Fucking bastards. How dare you? How dare you? You scumbags are working for fucking assholes who go into women's toilets. I'm so fucking angry that you guys have been used by a bunch of incels, a bunch of fucking men who go into women's toilets. You know what was just said to me? Men cannot go into women's toilets. So if I say someone is going into a women's toilet, they should be allowed to kick him a foot or kick him in the balls. You don't fucking trust me for standing up for women's rights. Don't.
For 8 years now, I've been standing up for women's rights and trying to get people's attention about what's happening to kids in gender clinics.
What you say?
Oh, come on, you're not seriously trying to say that children going to the doctor and saying that they're worried about their gender is akin to children being experimented on in Nazi concentration camps?
I'm afraid I am.
A group of highly ideological cultists have taken over institutions across society.
I just couldn't believe that the police are still doing the bidding of these dangerous activists.
But they would just say they're upholding the law, as it is at the moment.
What you say?
I said that central figures in the trans movement are nonsense.
Have you ever been awaiting trial for criminal charges, but were so addicted to doing hate crimes that you land yourself in jail before your trial has even begun? Have you ever been so obsessed with getting the attention of a billionaire children's author that you wrote an article demanding your mold-infested senpai notice you, but had to get arrested to make it work? Have you ever been so pathetic that you sent such horrific threats of violence against a minority group that you were apprehended by the law, but you had to go straight from prison to hospital for what we in the medical community call the consequences of your actions? Well, actually, we call them heart palpitations, and by we, I mean doctors, of which I am one, but not that kind. If this is you, and if all of those things have happened to you, the only thing I can diagnose you with is not being a dinosaur. And to be fair, that is a tricky diagnosis to make in the case of the one person this actually happened to. One Graham Linehan, former TV comedy writer turned professional tranny harasser.
This groomer has been filming people all day.
And you've been calling children domestic terrorists on Twitter.
Scumbag and an
You're a
incel
scumbag. You're the incel, you're divorced.
That he's a woman. So he
You're
can get into
divorced.
women's spaces.
You're divorced,
he's,
Graham.
Disgusting.
You're disgusting, Graham. You're divorced.
Sissy
What?
watching Scumbag.
And you're calling me the groomer.
And Rob Schneider's roommate. Now, you might think that someone who's claiming to fight for women's rights wouldn't want to live in Trump's America.
I'm not a Nazi.
But that's just who Graham Linehan is now. Living in Arizona so he can hang out with the star of gender swap comedy The Hot Chick, posting wojaks about how gender is good actually, and most of all, being so virulently transphobic, his only bail condition for his arrest upon returning to the UK from Arizona was not to tweet. And then he just tweeted. In a just world, that would have been the end of it, but his lawyer actually got the condition removed, so fuck it, nothing matters now. But do you know who's not tweeting? Me, Brigitte Empire, science and culture correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. Actually, that's not true. I am tweeting for my sins. There's just something about spending hours and hours of my day blocking a horde of obvious bots that gives me the same satisfaction other people get from deep cleaning or presumably having sex. I wouldn't know what that feels like. I've been stuck in these offices since I came of age, and the only person in this building even remotely interested in fooling around is our CEO. And to be honest, as is typical with the heads of British newspapers, I'm probably a little old for him. But soon, inshallah, we will also be joined in our dark sanctum by the spirit of Graham Linehan, the most malevolent ghost to ever set foot on Great Britain, an island already so evil that even its own citizens are going around painting Danish flags on roundabouts in a plea for the Vikings to return and put us all out of our misery. Either that or the flag shaggers are just stupid, and I've been told by my editors to get back to giving right-wingers the benefit of the doubt, so I can't agree with that. Speaking of which...
Even some on your own side say that sometimes you don't help their cause, your cause, because it would be better to act in a more civil way. Do you accept that?
I will not change the way I speak, the way I act, because of the demands of a few entitled narcissistic men.
You might remember that I recently put out a video about how Graham Linehan might be going to jail this month.
We are off to prison.
For all of the crimes that he did, and bragged about and posted video evidence of, saying that he did it and he enjoyed it. Believe it or not, this jailing is completely separate from that jailing, and by jailing I mean arresting, because neither times he's gone to jail. And this one occurred upon Linehan's return to his home in Britain, where he presumably is cursed to live in forever, despite the best attempts of Deuce Bigelow, European Gigolo's very own Rob Schneider, and the pleas of his lawyer to the Trump administration, but we'll get to that.
I have no problem with legal immigration. I'm just not sure Haiti is sending us their best cat-eating cannibals.
Incidentally, Rob Schneider has now announced that he's going to be paying Graham Linehan's legal fees. Why?
State of California make my kids wear masks in school, so we moved out to the slightly freer state of Arizona.
You don't live with this crazy bitch. You understand? She's like, she just wears me down. I do whatever she says.
Personally, I don't think he'll be able to leave. I think he's stuck here by a dark pact because he was such an asshole that the nation of Ireland declared him spiritually English. And by that I mean, well, look at what he's been doing for the past few years.
A transgender woman has spoken of the hell on earth she suffered after being raped and abused more than 2,000 times in an all-male prison, right? And he also says that they were in prison for 4 years. So someone wrote to me and they said 2,000 times in 4 years, 10 times a week, more than once a day, every day for 4 years.
Despite all of this worrying behaviour, Graham Linehan rejected the concerns of his friends and family and instead chose to become the most divorced man in human history, abandoning his family and, according to his social media and his autobiography, the vast majority of his friends, because they didn't believe that his anti-transgender crusade was good for his mental health, good for society, or just, good. So, once known for such classics as Father Ted, the IT Crowd, and being the one transphobe that's too disgusting for even J.K. Rowling to associate with, all of that is now behind him. And he's emerged a new man. A man who admits to watching sissy in court. A man who regularly harasses trans people and threatens them with violence. Of course, you wouldn't know that was what he was arrested for if you read much of the mainstream media, or the words of Django Kung-chained Rowling, who wrote, on finding out about the arrest of a man who she managed to ignore for the last few years despite him practically stalking her to try and get her approval. What the fuck has the UK become? This is totalitarianism. Utterly deplorable. Unfortunately, this does mean that the one good thing about J.K. Rowling is no longer in play. Her distaste for Linehan was the last thing about her sad little life that brought me joy. Well, that and how badly her books are doing, considering her fame these days. Look, they're in the bargain bin and they've been out for a day.
Dear Lord, what a sad little life, Jane.
Just in case there was any doubt, J.K. Rowling doesn't actually care about free speech. Just a short couple of days after that initial tweet, she was raging on Twitter that the police were mowing down trans counter-protesters outside one of her precious transphobe demos, where 5 old people gather to appropriate the suffragette flag. And in this tweet, she implies the police are part of a grand conspiracy to destroy anyone opposed to trans people, rather than the reality, which is different, to say the least. And if the police really were out to get her, you would think they would have responded to the tweet she put out not long before this, where she told a whimsical story about how her husband declared September should be open season on these meaning trans people and people that disagree with Gilling Coke Rowling about trans people. Anyway, unfortunately, Rowling now acknowledges Graham Linehan, which means that in response to his arrest, she took him into her inner circle, claiming that him being arrested for the minor crime of sending violent threats and repeated harassment represented a mass campaign of intimidation against women for standing up for their rights, and police turning a blind eye to the men publicly calling for women to be beaten. And which is baffling on so many levels, especially since this is a proud, real woman who goes by a man's name, claiming Graham Linehan is a women's champion.
Whack.
That and the fact that I and most trans people have received those very same threats, she seems to be implying that we are giving out, and that Graham Linehan in court explicitly said only come from our side.
For the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
These people are sick, and I don't say that lightly. The NCAA is a perverted organization. They platformed a biological male who won a national championship and then was allowed in incredibly disturbing detail to be around you and your fellow competitors. And again, I blame the decline of American men. This never should have been, someone should have just took care of it the way we used to take care of things in the 1950s or 60s.
We have to try to limit the harm. And that means reducing or keeping down the number of people who transition. And that's for two reasons. One of them is that every one of those people is a person who's been damaged. But the second one is every one of those people is basically, a huge problem to a sane world.
Speaking of calls to violence, what the hell was Graham Linehan even arrested for? And was it the horror story that people like Wes Streeting, J.K. Rowling, and of all people, Ro Khanna, say it was? Was it worth Wes Streeting insisting that the UK needed to change its very laws for? That we've become too hard on free speech? Not for trans people, of course, and definitely not for people supporting, say, Palestine action, but instead for Graham Linehan, who tweeted, presumably to tears of joy, from half-exercised haunted doll Wes Streeting, "If a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent, abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls." And this is the version of what happened according to Graham Linehan's own Substack, not according to the police. So this is the version of events most sympathetic to Linehan. So, all of this hysteria, the terror that the UK is just arresting people for tweets, should be filtered through the lens of what actually happened according to the person with the most interest in portraying it as a stitch-up. And yet still, this first tweet is, undeniably, a direct call to violence against all trans women. Translated from TERF speak, and the tweet says, "If a trans woman is in, for example, a women's toilet, he is inherently a violent, abusive criminal. You should respond by harassing him, sicking the cops on them, and violently assaulting them." Because lest we forget, assault is a crime, as is inciting violence and hate speech and harassment, that they're also criminal acts. So this doesn't look super great for old Graham here. You see, when you say things like, he was arrested for a tweet, it implies that the tweet was innocuous, not a call for violence against a minority group en masse. Twitter threats can be real threats, depending on the person and the audience, and he's got a sizable following. Libs of TikTok, for example, has a series of tirades that resulted in multiple threats in the US. And she's not the only person to incite violence against minorities via social media. Tommy Robinson, over the internet, incited and egged on racist pogroms against Muslims and immigrants only a short time ago. And that was in the UK. Tweets are not automatically trivial just because they're on Twitter, or X.com. In fact, I'd argue they're even less trivial now that Twitter has been overrun by people who sleep next to Adolf Hitler body pillows at night. And I say hate speech and incitement to violence instead of how most of the media is putting it, exercising free speech, because hate speech and incitement to violence have never been free speech. And in the UK, we don't even really have free speech protections like Americans do. Well, the ones that America used to have.
The fallout from Charlie Kirk's has spread to the workplace. People are getting fired for comments that seem to celebrate or glorify the of the MAGA activist and father of 2 young children. These companies and organizations have reported either terminating or suspending employees for posts about Kirk, and that includes Middle Tennessee State University firing a worker they say had, quote, zero empathy for Kirk's death. Conservative activists, Republican lawmakers, and even a doxing website are flagging the comments in what critics say is a campaign to punish those posters.
But every free speech crisis the press in the UK blabber on endlessly about is like this. There are genuine crises in free speech and the right to protest happening right now. Hundreds of people are being arrested for doing what's right and protesting the gravest injustices. But the press only wants to talk about Graham Linehan calling for all trans people to be assaulted, with The Sun even going as far to call him a genius. For what? For writing one good thing 30 years ago? However long it was? Or say Lucy Connolly, who we've all had to hear about for ages, as if she's someone who's been a victim of authoritarian overreach, just a poor, abused person, arrested for a tweet in which she said, "Mass deportation now. Set fire to all the fucking hotels full of the bastards for all I care. I feel physically sick knowing what these families will now have to endure. If that makes me racist, so be it." For those without context, that's the ultimate free speech victim in the UK, calling for hotels housing asylum seekers to be burned to the ground with the asylum seekers inside.
What the fuck?
But that's not the story told in the British media. The British media would have you believe that she was a poor young woman arrested for the crime of sending a tweet. A succulent little tweet. Even though she herself pleaded guilty in court to inciting racial hatred. Which was the crime here. Not tweeting, but inciting racial hatred. So while Graham Linehan is now getting puff pieces written about him on both sides of the Atlantic, crying about how he's never returning to the UK, and that he called Rob Schneider in tears to get the ear of Donald Trump, very cancelled and depressed of him that he can get in contact with literally the most powerful person on earth who agrees with him on literally everything. He's definitely the victim in this scenario. So remember that he's not, as the Daily Mail and a million other papers put it, a free speech refugee seeking asylum in the US over trans tweets. Instead, as Yorkshire Bylines put it, he is a well-known, well-established member of the gender-critical movement. His online audience and followers are typically fellow members of this movement. These individuals fundamentally object to trans people using gender-aligned services and wish to ensure that trans people are strictly prevented from accessing any such services. Some will be readily prepared to engage in individual vigilante action to police single-sex services to achieve this aim. Linehan's tweet specifies the situations in which violent action should be taken. If encountering a trans person in a gender-aligned service, this is not some hypothetical, abstract scenario, but a real-life situation which is likely to be occurring up and down the country as trans people continue to try and go about their lives post the Supreme Court ruling. Indeed, it is a scenario which many gender critics are constantly on the lookout for. This tweet details the violent action members of the public should take in the above scenario. The action is a physical and assault. And despite what many Americans like to think, this is not freedom of speech. Hate speech, at least in most cases, and definitely incitement to violence, are definitely not free speech. Free speech would be, for example, protesting the horrors happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, holding placards, shouting slogans, but, the media doesn't want to talk about that because they don't want that to be free speech, even though it should be, because it supports people who are the victims of Western aggression, instead of the people doing the Western aggression. Like Graham Linehan, who, according to the Daily Mail, is aiming to rebuild his life in America, and last night his friend and colleague, former Saturday Night Live star Rob Schneider, revealed that Mr. Linehan has hired MAGA lawyer Aaron Siri over the asylum bid to appeal to President Donald Trump. Mr. Siri is a vaccine skeptic who works closely with US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Mr. Linehan, who masterminded comedies such as The IT Crowd, Black Books and Motherland, has found a new life in Scottsdale, Arizona, known as an enclave of free speech. Ah yes, every time I think of somewhere with the moral clarity to protect freedom of speech for all, the last bastion of defence of the First Amendment, I personally think of the one, the only, Scottsdale, Arizona, a place I'd never heard of before reading this article, and I assume is only a location even mentioned because it's where Rob Schneider lives.
State of California make my kids wear masks in school, so we moved out to the slightly freer state of Arizona.
And when I think of people who have free speech as their number one priority, the foremost defenders of American values, I obviously think of Rob Schneider, the poor man's Adam Sandler, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the worm man's Robert F. Kennedy, and Donald Trump, the American man's Mussolini.
Pam Bondi's saying she's going to go after hate speech. Is that, I mean, a lot of your allies say hate speech is free speech.
You'd probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. It's hate. You have a lot of hate in your heart. Maybe they'll come after ABC.
If you don't believe that Donald Trump is the king of free speech, however, which, you know, after all the cracking down on free speech he's done, including defunding and threatening universities and states that disagree with him, especially regarding Palestine, immigration and trans people, and the deporting people for saying things he doesn't like, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you'll believe the United Nations General Secretary in 2019 on hate speech. Addressing hate speech does not mean limiting or prohibiting freedom of speech. It means keeping hate speech from escalating into something more dangerous, particularly incitement to discrimination, hostility and violence, which is prohibited under international law. In fact, even in the USA, where some hate speech is protected under the First Amendment, incitement to violence is not protected speech and falls outside of the protections of the First Amendment, according to the 1969 Brandenburg v. Ohio decision. Graham Linehan's speech, telling people to attack trans people on sight, would count, under that decision, as speech that is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless actions and is likely to incite or produce such action, and is therefore also illegal in the United States. And yes, even in the free speech bastion, famous the world over, that is Scottsdale, Arizona. Nevertheless, the bigot defence force came in the form of several high-profile and low-profile British political figures, and some American ones. Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch was critical of the arrest, saying, "Sending 5 officers to arrest a man for a tweet isn't policing, it's politics. Under Labour, we routinely see burglary, knife crime and assaults go unsolved, while resources are wasted on thought policing. It's time this government told the police their job is to protect the public, not monitor social media for hurty words. The Conservatives would stop this nonsense on day one and make public safety the first duty of policing, instead of pandering to fringe ideologies." Shadow Home Secretary Chris Phillip called Linehan's arrest totally disproportionate, especially given police often don't bother to follow up shoplifting, phone theft and car theft properly. This whole ordeal was made several steps sillier by Wes Streeting grovelling for his transphobic would-be base in the media and in, well, Rowling's wallet, saying that ministers needed to look at laws concerning online speech. Of course, had this been one of the groups Wes Streeting cares about being threatened, such as the government of Israel, or landlords, or racists, or transphobes, instead of one of his undesirables, I imagine his response would have been quite different.
I'm pretty depressed, to be honest.
Regardless, this incident was blasted over every front page in the UK, decrying the authoritarian turn in the United Kingdom, and if you squint at this, you can sort of see what the world would look like if British journalists had done their job and reacted appropriately to the combination of the Palestine Action Prescription as a terrorist group and the online safety bill that happened very recently. No, says the British media, those things are fine. What we don't like is people being arrested for incitement to violence. For example, the Daily Mail, who would be most happy to make out with Benjamin Netanyahu sloppy style, and are perhaps most famous for their article, "Hurrah the Black Shirts," came out guns a-blazing with the headline, "When did Britain become North Korea?" And another day in Starmer's socialist utopia, which raises so many questions, such as, do they seriously think Starmer's a socialist after everything he's done? He's more right-wing than any Prime Minister since Thatcher at this point. And for another, are we living in British Juche? Because if we are, we're doing a real bad job on the whole self-sufficiency front. The Telegraph, no relation, went, presumably with the approval of Kim Jong-un, with "Free speech laws need to be reviewed after Father Ted creator's arrest," Streeting says. Which, to give the Tory graph credit, which is something I genuinely hate to do, something Streeting actually said. Not because they're good at reporting, but because he's a fucking demon. And lo and behold, they fucked up immediately after this, with the subheading saying he was arrested for making jokes about trans people online. And after reading the tweets in question, I just have to say, where are the jokes?
Where are the jokes?
I mean, to be fair, I'm anti-police, but these people aren't. I would prefer no one went to jail, but if we're going to be throwing pensioners in prison for holding placards, we might as well throw in this guy.
I said that central figures in the trans movement are nonsense.
The man whom every trans person on the internet has at least one story of him defaming them and calling them a predator for even the most innocuous of reasons. Okay, well, that's not entirely fair. What I do think should happen is that someone using social media to stalk a minority group en masse should be blacklisted from that social media, his victims compensated, and him be made to see a therapist until he's resolved these issues. Or at least until he's not a danger to, and I can't stress this enough, an entire minority group which he harasses daily, for hours at a time, for years, and violently threatens.
The comedy writer is currently in the middle of a separate court case accused of harassment and criminal damage against a teenage trans activist.
I had my career destroyed, I had my musical taken away.
He knocked the phone out of her hand after posting that she was a sociopath and a domestic terrorist.
I had my marriage taken away.
What you say?
Graham Linehan later tried to claim that this was all a joke. And outlets such as Hack Centrist Slot Podcast and news agents went with this line, despite in context it obviously not being a joke, and that to take it that way you'd have to be, 1, extremely generous to the point of being so open-minded your brain falls out your skull, and 2, blind to how Graham Linehan has harassed trans women online to the point of previous police warnings and many lawsuits for the past decade.
I said that central figures in the trans movement are nonsense.
That would, you'd think, be pretty important context here. But no, we have to act as if we have no object permanence. Every centrist podcaster apparently blinked into existence yesterday and has to be explained basic concepts as if they're a fucking baby. So now we have to have a lengthy conversation about whether this was proportionate, which I'm assuming was helped by Graham Linehan persistently trying to play the victim card, despite him violently threatening an entire minority group and harassing us time and time again.
For 8 years now, I've been standing up for women's rights and trying to get people's attention about what's happening to kids in gender clinics, and for all of those 8 years I've been harassed.
After all, he pretty much went straight to hospital after this confrontation. In his own words,
"Eventually, a nurse came to check on me and found my blood pressure was over 200. Stroke territory. The stress of being arrested for jokes was literally threatening my life. So I was escorted to A&E, where I write this now, after spending about 8 hours under observation. The doctors suggest the high blood pressure was stress-related, combined with long-haul travel and lack of movement. I feel it may have also been a contributing factor that I have now spent 8 years being targeted by trans activists, working in tandem with police, in a dedicated, persistent harassment campaign, because I refuse to believe that lesbians have I looked at the single bail condition. I am not to go on Twitter. That's it. No threats, no speeches about the seriousness of my crimes. Just a legal gag designed to shut me up while I'm in the UK, and a demand I face a further interview in October."
Oh no, he's been made sick by being a persistent harasser who makes violent threats for for a decade. That's clearly the fault of his victims, not his own behaviour.
People you've just mentioned, by the way, names, they're not here. They are not here to defend themselves.
Name one person.
There are plenty
Name
of
one person who is calling out the trans rights activists who put images underneath their rallying tweets.
Do you regret having taken this path? Because you seem to have taken a more and more extreme path over the last few years.
How is it extreme?
I said that central figures in the trans movement are nonsense.
He's been unfairly targeted for the crime of being the one targeting people. And he's being silenced by having a very simple bail condition that wouldn't be a problem for most people because it doesn't fucking matter to be on Twitter. The condition that he doesn't log into the mass harassment machine. Something he immediately tripped over on the first hurdle and had to get lawyers to overturn. Because he's nothing if not predictable and so pathetic he couldn't do he couldn't just not tweet for like 2 days. This man, no matter what happens, cannot stop himself from harassing people online. He wakes up thinking about trans people, presumably with it. He falls asleep thinking about trans people, presumably with her. And that whole time he has a rage on so hard that he...
They took everything from me, you know.
Like what? What do you mean?
They took my family.
I'm gonna cry. Sorry, where was I? Oh yes, there was a whole to-do in the media about how it was insane to send armed police to arrest Graham at the border. Apparently, the reason they were armed is that they were at an airport and the airport cops are armed. Again, I think police shouldn't be allowed to carry guns. Ideally, they shouldn't exist at all. But if we're going to be debating proportionality, we should get our facts right, instead of acting like he was about to face a fucking firing squad. Should there have been 5 cops? Should they have been armed? This was the debate on Newsnight. Was this proportional? Was this incitement to violence even a real crime? Well, thankfully, Zach Polanski got elected leader of the Green Party this week, so we at least had someone on TV that thinks trans people deserve to live to inject some actual sense into this discussion. A discussion that, to be honest, is getting way more attention than it deserves.
Do you think this was proportionate?
I think it was proportionate to arrest him. I think there's a pattern here.
5 armed police officers turning up.
Well, that's the bit that I don't understand why they were armed, and again, I'd need to hear about the police
and why there were 5, presumably.
For sure.
Now, that's not to say there isn't a problem with lack of free speech in Britain, nor that restrictions on free speech aren't getting much, much worse. Very, very quickly. But that's not what we're seeing here. And the most obvious example of this crisis of free speech is something the British media really don't want to talk about, because they don't sympathise with the people being shut down. They sympathise with the bloodthirsty regime, hundreds of thousands, that those being shut down are protesting. But I do want to talk about the way the British media and British politicians, such as haunted Playmobil minifigure Wes Streeting, talked about Graham Linehan being arrested for violent threats. Is Graham Linehan being arrested literally 1984? Is Britain becoming a totalitarian state? Well, no to the first one, but for the second one, well...
For the second week running, they came to make a point, supporters of the now proscribed terror group Palestine Action, hoping that through sheer numbers they might render the government's crackdown unenforceable.
Police have arrested over 700 people since Palestine Action was proscribed as a terrorist organisation on 5th of July. At the largest protest, in Parliament Square on the 9th of August, nearly half of the 532 people arrested were aged 60 or older, according to the Met. It was the largest mass arrest in London since 1961. Nearly 100 of those detained were in their 70s, and 15 were in their 80s. Palestine Action is the first non-violent direct action group to be designated a terrorist organisation in the UK. Showing support for the group can carry a maximum sentence of up to 14 years in prison. One officer described feeling ashamed and sick when they arrested a disabled person on terror charges. "That feeling won't leave me anytime soon," they said. Another told an arrestee, "It's not the work I came into the police to be doing." Over the past 2 weeks, the UK has reportedly blocked internet users' access to everything from SpongeBob SquarePants gifts to Spotify playlists. Information about Joe Biden's police funding plan has been restricted, along with a post about an up-and-coming political party. Gamers say they have been unable to tweak colours in games such as Minecraft, and it's all because of a new age verification law. Since the child safety provisions contained within the Online Safety Act came into effect on the 25th of July, web service providers have been forced to institute highly effective age verification measures to prevent children from accessing harmful or adult content. The penalty for failing to adequately comply with the act includes hefty fines and potential criminal action. The Supreme Court's ruling that the legal definition of a woman was based on just biological sex meant transgender people should not be allowed to use toilets of the gender they live as, and that in some cases they could not use toilets of their birth sex, would effectively exclude transgender people from much of the public realm. It is also said that organisations such as sports clubs or hospitals could ask to see someone's birth certificate if there was genuine concern about what biological sex they are. But even all of that horrifying stuff that is overreach, I don't think we can really say this is the case for Graham Linehan, who, luckily for our purposes, released the audio of his arrest. So we can all now hear how normal and unarrestable he sounded, screaming at the police that he can't be arrested because he wrote Father Ted. Don't you know who he is? And that he's going to sue them all. Or, as he put it, sue them all into the ground.
Holy shit! I don't fucking believe it. I'm under arrest. I'm going to sue you into the ground. I'm going to sue you into the ground. I'm going to sue you into the ground. Fucking bastards. How dare you? How dare you? You scumbags are working for fucking assholes who go into women's toilets. I'm so fucking angry that you guys are being used by a bunch of incels, a bunch of fucking men who go into women's toilets. You know what was just said to me? Men cannot go into women's toilets. So if I say someone is going into a women's toilet, they should be allowed to kick up a foot or kick him in the balls. You don't fucking cuff me for standing up for women's rights. Don't cuff me.
Later in court, Graham Linehan described how the British police are part of a great conspiracy to protect trans people, who Graham Linehan says he hates, and that we're all perverts and abusers, and so the police are teaming up with us to go after strong feminist women like Graham Linehan. Okay, if we stop every time we hit something baffling with Graham Linehan, we'll be here all day. And I will get to some of the more baffling stuff from the trial later. This was supposed to be a quick update, not a 5-hour epic, but looking at the runtime now, it's probably a 1-hour one. So for now, let's take a look at this very normal sandwich board Graham Linehan was wearing in front of the courthouse before his trial. His trial, remember, to determine whether he had harassed a trans child. This is obviously the behaviour of someone who would clearly never harass a trans child. A class of people he, on his sandwich board outside his trial for harassing them, believes does not exist. And believing a classification of people don't exist is a sentiment, of course, that no one has ever expressed towards a group of people that they believe should be eliminated. This, by the way, J.K. Rowling lied about being real, saying that it was invented by India Willoughby, a trans woman, to smear Graham Linehan, despite it being filmed and clearly taken at multiple angles as a statement that he was making himself. The Graham thought made him look really cool, but actually made him look extremely guilty. But yes, the police thing, the police conspiracy theory, the police working with trans activists to destroy hard-working feminists. You can even read about how Graham said that in court in The Guardian, of all places, which doesn't often report things accurately when it comes to trans issues. According to them, Graham Linehan claims in court that the police are basically working for trans activists, and said other extremely normal things, like that his victim, a minor who he harassed relentlessly, and who you can see in video here, him calling a groomer and a sick sissy obsessed freak, along with a bunch of other things.
This groomer has been filming people all day.
And you've been calling children domestic terrorists on Twitter.
Scumbag and an
You're a
incel
scumbag. You're the incel. You're divorced.
That he's a woman. So he
You're
can get into women's
divorced.
spaces.
You're divorced,
he's
Graham.
Disgusting.
You're disgusting, Graham. You're divorced.
Sissy
What?
watching scumbag.
And you're calling me the groomer.
This man is almost half a century older than the teenager he's screaming at, by the way. That she is a young soldier in a trans activist army. That she's a born liar. That she's misogynistic, abusive, snide, and a psychopath. This is a person pushing 60 talking about a teenager. In fact, just to illustrate how batshit this whole thing is, and how bizarre it was that after this man's arrest a couple of days ago, he had the entire UK media falling over itself to call him a hero, just listen to this exchange from his trial. The expression sissy watching.
That was something I feel a bit of regret about, because that was a guess. I think he does what he does because he's a sadist.
There are all manner of insults you could have used.
Yes.
But you chose cis.
It's sissy.
You must be more familiar with it than me.
Oh, I am. I really am.
And just in case you're one of these weirdos trying to find some way to claim Graham Linehan is just weird about this one trans woman and not all trans people, look at his own words from this case, which is just, all in all, a fascinating character study of a man so deep in a conspiracy theory that the whole world is being puppeted by a sinister minority that he not only lost his wife, his family, his friends to keep going down the rabbit hole, but is now in court for harassing literal children, and in a way of presumably trying to keep himself from seeing how much he just looks like a Saturday morning cartoon villain, claiming his victim wasn't a child because it makes no sense, because all trans people are just pathological liars. In a reply, you called them scumbag, homophobic, sociopathic sadists. Did you mean Miss Brooks?
I meant Brooks, that group of men, and all TRAs.
So you think all TRAs are scumbag, homophobic, sociopathic sadists?
Yes.
And here he is, sounding like the child catcher. Trying to find out where she was studying. Were you trying to intrude on her life?
I was, because he is a criminal. He harasses people, and he's a sadist.
And just to put a cherry on this very horrible cake, this is what Graham Linehan said upon being confronted by the fact that he's the villain in this story. Something he denies because his enemies, in this case a literal child, are ontologically evil. This is the man Wes Streeting wants to change UK law to protect. You're aware, aren't you, that repeatedly abusing Miss Brooks in the way you did was harassment?
He harasses people. The police won't do anything about it. The press won't cover it, so I was trying to do something about it.
Why is you posting relentless abuse about Miss Brooks, not harassment?
Because if he didn't harass women and try and get people to punch them, he succeeded once. He tried and failed with someone else, and he's trying to do it to me.
One rule for gender-critical people who are allowed to harass and TRAs can't?
TRAs hate women, and I hate them!
Or, if you want to hear about what Graham said to his victim on the incident where he escalated from regular harassment to violent harassment plus property damage, the scriptwriter approached her with his phone, recording her and calling her a groomer, and asking how many she had groomed. This is a middle-aged man talking to a 17-year-old. Brooks asked him why he had called her a domestic terrorist. He said,
"Go away, groomer! Go away, you disgusting incel!"
He then called her a sissy watching scumbag and deliberately whacked the phone out of Miss Brooks's hand. So, free speech warriors? Is this your king? Like, there are real problems with free speech in Britain. This is not the person you want to be lining up behind. No, these people are. Police in London on the 9th of August arrested 522 people who were protesting against the United Kingdom's recent decision to ban the group Palestine Action, a tally thought to include the highest ever recorded at a single protest in the British capital. The Metropolitan Police on Sunday updated its previous arrest tally of 466 and said that all but one of the 522 arrests took place at a protest in central London's Parliament Square and were for displaying placards backing Palestine Action. The other arrests for the same offence took place at nearby Russell Square as thousands rallied at a Palestine Coalition march demonstrating against Israel's war in Gaza. The protests were the latest in a series of rallies denouncing the British government's ban of Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act 2000 on July 5th. Days after the group took responsibility for a break-in at an Air Force base in southern England that caused an estimated £7 million of damage to 2 aircraft. The group said its activists were responding to the UK's indirect military support for Israel amid the war in Gaza. Huda Amouri, co-founder of Palestine Action, said ahead of Saturday's protests that they would go down in our country's history as a momentous act of collective defiance of an unprecedented attack on our fundamental freedoms. Palestine Action, while labelled a terrorist group, for spray painting a plane. Now labelled as on the same level as the Taliban, expressing support for them can result in over a decade in prison. This blind, disabled man holding a placard? The United Kingdom has designated him a terrorist, simply for holding a sign. Compare this to the furore about Graham Linehan, and you can clearly see what an actual crackdown on free speech looks like. And at the time of writing this, it is happening again. 1,500 protesters protesting the worst thing it's possible for any society to do, a mass slaughter. And the police are there making as many arrests as they can, because free speech is only allowed in Britain if it's racists screaming at asylum hotels, transphobes calling for us all to go to camps, anything but doing what is right. At the end of the protest, 857 more people were arrested for holding signs saying, "I oppose I support Palestine action." This should be the big story, not fawning pieces about a man arrested for hate speech and incitement to violence for the crime of doing hate speech and harassment to violence. Maximum 14 years in prison for wearing a shirt or holding a sign implying you support the spray painting of a plane in protest of but more importantly, that you oppose the in Gaza, something Graham Linehan, incidentally, does not. If we can't protest a literal of all things, if we can't express opposition to the worst thing it is possible for humanity to do without fear of being thrown in jail for what, a sixth of the average lifespan of a human being? Then we do not have free speech. We live at the mercy of monsters who defend, aid and support with arms and intelligence the mass slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent people by a foreign state, while throwing their own citizens in jail for not enthusiastically enough cheering on the bloodshed. This is the real threat to free speech in the UK. But if you believe Graham Linehan, you think that the police right now are slaves to the depraved and criminal masterminds in the trans rights movement. As Graham himself said to the Times very unconvincingly, "I've exposed the police for what they are. I could not be happier," he said, looking like a man who'd just been personally visited by Jesus Christ to tell him that he's going straight to hell. And to be fair, if you ever catch yourself saying, as Graham did, "The police, after being called institutionally racist, have done this ridiculous overcompensation, which means they're literally working for a sort of Al Capone gang in fishnets." Especially when the police are literally out on the streets, dragging people into vans and threatening them with over a decade in prison for holding a sign to protest a literal. Well, I don't believe in hell, but if it did exist, it would be perfect for people who say that kind of shit while this kind of shit is happening. And of course, for the people doing the which Graham Linehan supports and ridicules people for opposing. And this whole media farce is a huge distraction from. When people want to look up crackdowns on the freedom of speech in Britain, they should be seeing wall-to-wall coverage of the crackdowns on pro-Palestine protests and people suspected of being supportive of Palestine action. Not this cave troll who literally said in his court hearing, "I find police are basically working for trans activists these days. They don't understand the issue and believe everything trans activists say to them," and who claimed the child that he harassed was lying about her age to garner sympathy. He said Miss Brooks has been involved in trans activism since 2013. Prosecutor Julia Farrer-Walker said Miss Brooks would have been 6 years old at the time. "So he says," Linehan replied. Miss Farrer-Walker said that Miss Brooks' driving licence proves she is 18. "If you can lie about your name and sex, you can lie about anything," Linehan replied. Protect actual free speech, not the right for serial harassers and hate campaigners to incite violence en masse without consequences. With any luck, and let's be honest, this is Britain, so we're going to need it, consequences will come for this complete pest who's made so many people's lives hell for a decade. And perhaps even more unlikely, but most crucially, consequences will come for the country doing this to people in Palestine. As I'm filming this, Israel just bombed the fucking Global Freedom Flotilla to end the siege in Gaza and feed the fucking starving people there with a drone off the coast of Tunisia. I wish I believed in hell so that I could believe that Netanyahu's going there. Free Palestine. And as for Graham Linehan, in October, I hope we see some form of justice for this. For the rest of you, thanks for watching. There once was a man who went to court against a transgender teen. He bravely fought, said to the judge, I've sissy smut bought. Go me Graham boy grow. Soon may the Linehan come to court for being such bigot scum. One day when the suing is done, he'll take his leave and go. For 14 years or even more, this cave troll weirdo screamed and swore. Went so far that he got divorced. Go Helen Serafinovich, go. Soon may the Linehan come to court for being such bigot scum. One day when the suing is done, he'll take his leave and go. Soon may the Linehan come to court for being such bigot scum. One day when the suing is done, he'll take his leave and go. Hey, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you liked it and you're not Graham Linehan, why not like it? Give it a comment. Like that phrasing always fucking sucks. I need to change that. Leave a comment, subscribe, tell your friends about it. Yes, don't be a Graham Linehan. And if you're not Graham Linehan, stay tuned, because it's coming up to autumn now, where my birthday is. It's in October. And so I am pushing my Get Brigitte Empire out of her overdraft before her birthday initiative. So if you want to help with this and get me debt-free before 34, God, that would have sounded better a year earlier, you can give me one-time donations on Coffee or PayPal, links below as always. And from now, this is new, you can also go to my Fourth Wall page and buy some official Brigitte Empire merchandise, by which I mean I put the Daily Telegraph on some shirts and my logo on some stickers, so you can buy them and help me out if you feel weird about giving me money and only getting my gratitude in return. Or if you just want a shirt, maybe you want a shirt. It's not bad, it looks pretty good. I ordered one myself, it was nice. But if you don't want to do that, but you also want to get some lovely benefits for supporting me, you can do that. And I encourage you, because it's the best thing you can do. And my favourite thing for people to do, and you should do it, you specifically, I'm talking to you, Davina, is sign up to my Patreon or YouTube memberships, where you get early videos, access to the members only Discord, my Nintendo Switch friend code, and exclusive content from interviews and stuff that I've done, and soon more stuff I have in the works, but I'm not ready to say it just yet because I need to do some tests. But yes, you can do that. And if you do that, you will also get your name read out at the end of each video, which obviously you all want to do. Your name could be here next to Buried Elk, Ewan Bennett, Bags, Mautum, Gina Service, You Are Madoff Stupid, Tomo, Melissa Jackson, Ren approves of your stuff. Thanks, Ren. Minstrel, of course. Emma, not Emma. Jeffreyon. Tom, the not quite so brave as Sir. Lancelot. LFR. Tricoi. Ariella, Proqua, Robin Thomas, Kathy, 1410, It's She, Justice for my boy Gandalf, Garlic Scape, Kira B, No Sparkling Heart, Corey, Gianna J, Mightier Than the Sword, Carolyn, Imogen Q, Luciano Frias Andrade, Adam, Harry, Endog191, Cav, Quesadilla de Tortilla Azul, Leron, Adam Lees, Daniel Nevels, no, not that, Paul, MB, Wandering Wonder, Lex Phoenix, Ender Kurzitz, Mira D, Jade Senior, Boa Ear, James W, Martha and or Thorngill, Deborah Laboon, Zillas Athenaeum, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Lissette, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena Real, Sierra Whiskey, Ali Catgill, John N, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Daden, Robin Podolsky, Nightlight, Plushy Jesus, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabroga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, PJ Lisbroll, Howard Lott, Neranir Scarjan, Jade Luciferian, Ataraxis Builds Things, Sarah Francesca Smith. Thank you all so much for supporting me. It means a whole lot. Yeah, no, I don't say that enough. Thank you. I think you're great, and I really appreciate you letting me make this a thing that I can do, because I like doing it, And every other job I had has not been as fun or good at this, even if sometimes I talk about stuff which is real depressing. I hope you had fun laughing at Graham Linehan with me and didn't get too upset that I put messaging in it about the stuff that's happening, which, yeah, I tend to do that. It's important. I would feel irresponsible if I didn't, and also it was relevant. And I don't know why I'm apologizing. This is the format of video essays. Is you know. I don't know what I'm saying. I just don't want to press the stop button yet. How are you guys? How's your mum? Still a woman? Cool. What's for lunch? Okay, I'm gonna go now. What is wrong with me?
Soon may the Linehan come to court for being such bigot scum. One day when the suing is done, he'll take his leave and go.